This episode is going to be all about this first card here, which is API fundamentals. If you've ever used popular workflow tools like Zapier or Make.com or N8N, all of those steps, all of those zaps, all of those tasks that are running are basically all API calls. If you're hearing about agents and how they use tools, agents are right now the hottest topic at the time of recording this video going into 2025. Everyone's talking about agents and how they have tool usage or how you can connect ChatGPT to external data sources or things that you use like your calendar, your email. Those are all essentially going to be API calls. And so that's why I'm going to focus for this first video of tech fundamentals on APIs and how we can learn all the basics that you need to prompt agents to build your own APIs. We're going to build our own APIs so that we can dissect the structure and everything that's going to be important. And that's going to lead into another video, which I'll do later, on how we can build our own basic AI workflow or agent that we can call directly in Slack. And it's all going to stem from these fundamentals on building and prompting through APIs. So first things first, what is an API? So this right here is probably one of the best pieces of writing on this topic, which is by Colin Matthews on Lenny's newsletter. If you're not familiar with Lenny, Lenny is a premier product manager, content creator in tech, probably runs the most popular media company for PMs in tech. And Colin is another product manager, but Colin focuses on teaching tech fundamentals to product managers. He might go a bit deeper. If you're interested in learning about app architecture and things like that, Colin helps product managers in tech learn all of those deeper fundamentals so that they can communicate with engineers. So PMs at big companies like Meta or Netflix are primarily people he works with. But if you're interested, go Google Colin Matthews Maven course, and I'm sure you'll see it come up if you're interested in taking that. For our case, we're going to be focusing on people in sales, marketing, RevOps, and the fundamentals that you need to build your own workflows to give you leverage in your day-to-day work. So first things first, what is an API? It all starts with this. So this graphic right here kind of outlines everything. You have your client here, which could be a website, it could be an app, it could be your own web app that calls and communicates directly with this API. And that API formats these requests that it's sending from the client and does something to manipulate them to communicate with maybe some service or data source that is housed by the company that it owns. So everything from Airbnb to Meta to Etsy to OpenAI is all using APIs to communicate with the service that that company owns. So if you're using, every time you send a message to ChatGPT, it's sending a call to the OpenAI API using the LLM in the background to send back the response in the form of a chat response. If you're using Airbnb and you've searched listings in Toronto, it's calling the Airbnb API and it's going and fetching that data and sending it back to you and surfacing on the Airbnb.com website. So that's basically how it's constructed. In each API, we basically have different resources and endpoints. So if you're on the listings page, like we were just talking about in the example above, and you're looking for Toronto's, it's going to go to the listings endpoint. And if maybe you open your profile, it's going to go to the user's endpoint. And in a second here, we're going to deconstruct how requests are formatted so that they properly get routed. But you can see here, again, it's showing multiple different versions of a client, everything from a mobile app to a website to the broader internet to even computers and programs like AI agents all use APIs to interface and get resources from external data sources or using external services to do tasks that are provided by other companies and services, for example, OpenAI and their LLM services. And so back down here, Colin has this really nice graphic to outline how endpoints and different resources work. So endpoints and resources is a key term. You know, if you're taking notes, that's a key word to keep in mind. Endpoints and resources are, again, the paths that the developer has exposed on their API that points to a specific resource. So you can see in the blue here, the endpoints that have been created are up here for images, for image/generations, image/edits. So if you're dealing with OpenAI and any image generation like Dolly, if you've ever asked for it, if you have ChatGPT Pro and asked for an image of a hamster, it's going to call this API endpoint. If you're just having a regular chat with ChatGPT, it's going to call the chat endpoint. All of that is tied to the API, the base URL of api.openai. And so that's all running on the API server. and it's going to go and fetch it either from the database or from, the LLM service that it has set up. So if you did this audio/speech generation, it would go ahead and generate this MP3 file. And there are different types of requests that you can send. So back to the Airbnb example, we can do a simple fetch, which is called a GET request. Now with APIs, you can do different types of requests depending on the type of action that you're creating. And let me go over to this graphic right here. All this is done through the same URL, like same formatting and structure. Let's go back here. The very first type is a GET request. And so these are pretty simple and straightforward, where you are going to use a GET request simply to just fetch information that exists on that external data source. So for example, in the Airbnb client, if you're scrolling through listings, all that it's doing is doing a GET request. And again, it's using this endpoint. It's using the base URL of the API. So this is the base layer of the API that has all the possible endpoints. We're going to listings if we're on the listings page. And then we have what's called a query parameter. And that's usually what's used for GET requests. There's different formats you can use for GET requests, but most of the time I've seen them structured such that you have the query parameter directly in the URL. So what does that mean? It's basically telling the API when we go make a call to the API and the listings endpoint, hey, take note of this data. And I know you can properly see, and if I ever have a query parameter, this question mark and location, I want you to take everything that's after that equal sign and then probably some character that ends here. I want you to take that all those characters, that string, Toronto, and use that to go fetch that data. So that basically is telling the API at listings, take that Toronto parameter and go and give me all of the listings that exist in Toronto. And that is GET method in a nutshell. Now, these other ones I'm going to quickly run through because I want to focus on GET and posts. So I'm going to quickly run through posts because we're going to go into it deeper, because 99% of your focus and usage of APIs is probably going to be around GET and post methods. Post is similar to a GET method where you can use it to fetch data, and you can also use it to create a new resource in a database. Creating resources is less important unless you're building your own SaaS, but we'll get back to that in a second. Put and patch and delete are, again, you're not usually going to be doing these types of requests because you don't own the API, and they're usually not going to expose that type of permission for you to be able to edit or delete resources that exist on the data. So imagine if you could go into Airbnb and send like an update resource a patch request to the API endpoint, you'd be able to start just bopping people out of the Toronto listings that we were just talking about. But quick overview, put is a little bit more dangerous because it can completely replace resources entirely. If you don't have all the fields, let's say back to our Toronto example, for each update, you could send the name of the house, the street address, and the price of the per night pricing for renting that house. If you send just the title of the name as a put request, then the pricing and the street address just get eliminated because they weren't included in that request. So you have to make sure you include every single field that belongs to that listing, or else it'll just, if you send it as a put request, it'll just basically delete it. Or if it just doesn't exist, maybe like street address is like a unique thing and it says, hey, there's no listing here that has a street address. I'm just going to go create it. That's what a put request is for, is if you want to update or create a new thing, use put. And then patch is a little safer for updating. Going back to that example of the listing where we have a street address, the name, the title of the listing, and the price. Let's just say we're updating the price of going from $125 a night to $250 a night. We would send a patch request that says like pricing equals $250, and it would go ahead and just update the pricing, and then street address and the title of it and all the other data included on that listing would not get touched. So it's a little bit safer. And so patch requests, whenever you're updating something like your profile, patch requests are being used in the background. So just keep that in mind as you're using apps and you're updating some little detail on your profile. It's sending a patch request to the API of whatever that service or app you're using. And then lastly, delete method is pretty self-explanatory, very rarely used. If you go and maybe delete an account, it's going to go ahead and just delete your entire user resource in the background. So that's it. Those are the 4 different types of requests. And then I also want to quickly jump through, we'll come back to this later, but the different types of responses that you can get. We're going to go back to GET requests, which we just covered, and move on to POST requests, which is very similar. Like I said, Post requests can be used to retrieve data, or they can be used to update or create data. And the way that we send the data that either we want to manipulate or use or fetch, you can see all of that information for how we want to use the endpoint is stored in a body. And so maybe in another episode, we'll probably cover the basics of JSON or how data is modeled if you're unfamiliar with that. But this is how we send data via a post request, is in the body, not in the URL. You can see the key difference here is that we don't have this query parameter involved in the URL. We don't have this green part, but we still have those two main pieces, which is the base URL and the endpoint. So now we switch back over to OpenAI as our example. We have our base URL, so the base URL of the API we're using, and we're using an endpoint that exists, image generations. And then in the way that it's used is we have to send the model name. So the model that we'd be using is DALL-E 3. We're prompting for a cute baby otter. And then you can also add how many images you want and then size. And then later in this video, as we first experiment with some APIs to show you how we can make calls to these directly with code. And then in just a second, I'm going to be showing, how we can actually go through and learn what endpoints actually exist in an API that we're using. Like, how do we even know that we should be using after this base URL? Like, hey, we might know api.openai.com exists, but how we know that images/generations exist? Like, how do we know it's not images/make as the endpoint name? Like, how do we know what URL to type in and tell the computer, like, hey, go check out this endpoint? I'll show that in a second. And it's, spoiler alert, it's called developer documentation. And then more importantly, like, how do we know what body parameters we can send into those requests so that we properly get what we want? But before we dive into practicing how to make requests to APIs, I want to quickly cover the different types of responses that we can expect from an API when we send a request. The very first one that I want to mention is 404, because this means, hey, you actually, if we sent that request to images/make, we would get a 404 request because that path does not exist. And you might be familiar with this too. If you ever visit a URL or a domain on a website and you put like a / some path name that does not exist, like they don't have that page, what's happening is that exact same thing. And maybe you go and try to access like someone else's profile, or maybe your own profile, but you're signed in on your phone, not your computer, which we'll get into API authentication in another video. That's one of the tech fundamentals we'll cover later. But if you go to a page that you're not authenticated or signed in for, you're going to get a 401. So let's say, for example, on Airbnb, if we tried to access like someone's profile and type in their username on airbnb.com/username, you're going to get a 401 because you're not authorized to use it. And then this one is out of your control. And sometimes you'll run into it. And this basically means the developers have put in error states where if there's some bug that breaks down in the API logic, they send a 500 error to tell you basically, or tell your computer rather, your client, whether you're visiting from your browser or from your mobile app. This basically tells your computer like, hey, sorry, the developers, like this is actually an error on our end, like our bad. We're going to fix this as soon as possible because they probably have like an error log where they can see like, hey, someone had a 500 error. You better go check this out on the API logic. And then lastly is we have a 200 success error. And this is what you want to be hitting most of the time. It means, hey, you've successfully retrieved it. You called the endpoint correctly. The endpoint exists. Here's all your data, or here's the response that you're looking for. And then you have to go through and handle that response. So we'll cover a little bit more about response formatting in API authentication and JSON data structures in future videos, but that's a quick overview on the types of requests that you can expect. For this next stage, let's just move over to a demo and actually try out this example here where we call the OpenAI APIs and try to generate an image of a cute otter. So now we are going to do a quick demo on how we actually call APIs that are set up by external services. Again, if you stick around, we will show you how we can go ahead and deploy our own APIs/servers. But for this one, we're just going to do a simple script calling someone else's API, trying to recreate this example in Colin's article on creating a baby otter image using OpenAI's image generation endpoints. Now, the very first thing that we highlighted earlier is like, how do we even know what endpoints are even available or know what we could send in the body of the request? Like, what data is OpenAI going to expect so that we can properly call it and avoid errors like 401 or 500 or 404 not found. So just basically, how do we avoid errors? Because we have to know what endpoints exist. Like if you go back up here, how do we know, chat and images exist? And so that brings me to the first part. The first thing I'm going to do is actually come over to Perplexity. And right now I'm on Perplexity Pro, and I recommend it for if you're going into coding tasks. I recommend it because it is an AI agent that does searches, because what it's going to do is first look at your query, understand what API you're going to use, read that documentation, and then take another step to format it into code so that you can just bring it over into Repl for usage. So I'm going to ask it, what is the latest API or way to call OpenAI for DALL-E image generation? I want to make a simple Python request to create a baby otter. And so you can see the pro search. First thing it's going to do is check the OpenAI documentation, and then go ahead and format the call in the way. And you can see it's actually really similar, and it might be exactly the same as it is right now in Colin's example down here, using the same exact body and perhaps the same exact URL. The one key thing that I do see missing is that URL. Like, what is the URL endpoint that we have to put into our request to make that call? The other thing of why I really enjoy using Perplexity for these types of tasks is that it includes a really nice way to quickly go and double check resources. So this is another tech fundamental lesson that maybe you're not familiar with if you're less technical, but is API documentation. So documentation, if you ever hear that term thrown around by developers, is usually referencing this, which is a guide on how to properly use the tools that they've set up, particularly APIs. So every company, if they have an API that's public and they want developers to start using, they basically go through and they go and create articles on how to use every single one of those endpoints. The documentation is going to include what endpoints even exist. And again, back to that question, that fundamental question that we had on like, how do we even properly call all those resources that are available? What is the API going to expect? What should we expect in the responses for properly handling it and using it in our own apps and workflows? So that's what documentation means. And that's why we use Perplexity. And even if we wanted to improve this prompt even better, we could even say that now that you have this knowledge, you could say, look through the OpenAI documentation for X, Y, and Z, or look through the Smartly documentation or whatever API, or the HubSpot documentation. Whatever API you're using, you could use that to drastically improve and focus Perplexity, or even Repl, once it has internet access. So we're going to dive in. We're going to use some of the resources here and start copying and pasting documentation. And one quick note on just creating a new REPL. I just went create a REPL. And REPL is the best because you can use and run any language, and it's super easy. In a second, when we deploy our own servers and APIs, that's the best experience. The best experience is on REPL by far. But right away, we can use languages like Python or practically any language. And I also want to highlight most APIs or backend servers are going to run on either Python or Node.js. Python is always what I default to because things like LangChain or CrewAI, or basically many fundamental AI frameworks are running on Python or are only Python compatible. So that if we ever wanted to bring those in or experiment with them, I kind of just default with Python as a get-go. And maybe in another tech fundamentals video, we'll go into the trade-offs, but we're going to stick with Python for this example. So I'm going to call API call example image generation. Create our REPL. And the very first thing is we are going to go back over to this, and we're going to bring it over, and we're going to say, make me a simple script that will call OpenAI DALL-E to generate an image of a cute otter. Here is the code. Here we go. And you can note really quickly right now, if we're starting with a language, we can use the assistant, which at the time of this recording, REPL has the AI agent and the AI assistant. Once you're starting to get some of these tech fundamentals, I strongly prefer the AI assistant. One, because it's a lot cheaper. And number two, because it is a lot more precise on, especially if we know exactly what we're going to be using and what we want to implement, it's going to be a lot more direct. We don't need to build out a whole feature with this. We just need a simple script and we have the code already provided. So it's going to go ahead and do this and add it into main.py. Well, I have the settings really quickly on my assistant settings. If I go up in here, I have it turned to where I have to hit accept in order for it to apply the changes. But if you want, you can go ahead and turn that off so that it could auto apply, or sorry, you could go ahead and turn on the changes so that it can go ahead and auto apply any of those changes that it's going to recommend. And then I get to go ahead and click on main.py. So it's going to go to the right file and it's going to show me the code it's about to add. And again, it looks exactly the same as what Perplexity provided us. And we're going to go ahead, overwrite, and apply. And then one quick note on one thing that we are missing. So you can see right now, we don't have a URL. We don't have a URL implied. What it's using is what's called an SDK. And an SDK is kind of just a way for OpenAI or developer teams at other companies to wrap a lot of their most common tasks within a library of code. So when we're hitting this specific line where it's saying import OpenAI, that's importing the SDK, which basically wraps an easy way to create a connection to OpenAI so we don't have to type out a bunch of extra tasks or a bunch of extra characters in our code and make it a lot messy. Because if this script kept expanding, every line of code adds more complexity, makes it a little harder to read. So developer teams, especially at bigger companies like OpenAI, they go ahead and wrap some of those calls, those most common calls, in their SDKs. And that way we can make it a nice and clean call where it looks very similar to a URL where we're calling images.generate, and then we have the body here. Another thing or reason for why this is preferred or why could be really nice when an SDK is provided is that it will be much easier to print errors. They've also built out a lot of, in the background, for if we ever type something wrong, it will print out an error with a lot more detail. And again, we'll probably have another video on tech fundamentals on debugging and errors in a future video, but those are extremely important, especially in the age of AI development, because if you give an error with a lot more detail, again, like the whole topic of these videos is learning how to prompt and give AI more technical direction, and errors and printing out errors with more details. If we go and copy and paste those errors into an AI and we ask it like, hey, what's going on? An SDK usually has more details in those errors that we're going to copy and paste to give the AI so it knows exactly what to fix. Again, we'll probably get into that later if we do hit any errors, but for now, we'll go ahead and do that. The other nice thing about REPL is it can go ahead and install all of the packages that we need. So if we use an SDK, if we use a package, we have to go ahead and install it if it's external. So this import OpenAI, we have to go ahead and install it. Really quickly, if we ever want to go manage that, we could go and search for dependencies here if we just hit this new plus button, or we could go into all tools and go and search for dependency. The other thing before I hit run on this is one key thing about APIs that I don't think is as important to cover, because I think OpenAI has kind of introduced the concept of keys to everybody. But the way that we want to store API keys, it's just one way of authenticating and be able to use those resources is by using API keys. So you can see it's going to try to call this OpenAI API key, and right now we don't have any in our secrets environment. So this secrets environment is how we can securely store keys. When we make a call to the OpenAI API, it knows, hey, this is actually tied to an actual account, and we'll know how to charge it if once we start using the resources that OpenAI provides. I'm just going to call it image gen key demo, and go ahead and grab this key, bring it over here, paste it in, and add the secret. And right away, that gives us, you can see that is going to give us the ability to call this. In Python, the way to extract securely the keys is by using this simple little line called OS environ. You add brackets and then call the key by the name of the key in here that it's stored as. So now we're finally ready to run. We've installed our dependencies. We're not using the URL. This call structure was provided by Perplexity, which searched the OpenAI documentation. We've added our API key. We're ready to go. Let's hit run. And the way that we know it's still running is that this seconds timer is still going. And then a second here, we should be getting a print statement of the URL. Let's click it. And we got our cotter, our cute otter. So mission success, we've basically gone ahead and applied all of the basic lessons that we learned on calling APIs. The one key thing from this article that was a little bit different is we use the SDK instead of the direct URL. But we learned about post requests, get requests, how to properly call them. That is how we actually use other people's APIs. We're now going to go ahead and build our own API server.